Welcome to the Regenerative Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Zack Gazzaniga, who is the founder of Zack's Mighty. Zack's Mighty is supporting regenerative agriculture with its tortilla chip products made with certified regenerative corn. In this episode, we learn about Zack's journey in CPG, helping to build and scale Sir Kensington's, why he was compelled to make chips that don't break and dip, and the wild ride building Zack's Mighty supply chain that included everything from importing an heirloom variety of corn into the U.S., setting up supply direct trade relationships with farms, investing in proprietary manufacturing processes, and certifying their regenerative claims through a greener world. Zack oozes with CPG intel, and this episode was fun and crazy packed with insights about building a compelling modern-day snack brand powered by regenerative agriculture. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have our friend Zack from Zack's Mighty joining us. So welcome, Zack.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
We're super pumped. I'm personally super pumped. I've been consuming Zack's Mighty since I first found it on shelves, I think at natural grocers. And I think I was mostly intrigued by the weightlifting cob of corn on the front of the bag.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, is this chip really that strong? And I was not disappointed. And I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of that in this podcast. But for those who are unfamiliar with Zack's Mighty, give us a quick lay of the land. What do you produce? What sort of flavors do you have? Where can people find your products today?
Sure. We are a tortilla chip company that launched in 2020, so relatively new. We have 3 SKUs of organic tortilla chips that are made with certified regenerative corn, a sea salt, lime, and nacho chip. They're sold nationally at Whole Foods. They're in Publix. We just got into Publix a few months ago as our our largest conventional retailer.
Congrats.
We're in a lot of the usual suspects in the natural world, so kind of your local co-op, we're probably there. And we are about to have our first rotation in Costco in January, which is super exciting. So that's the tortilla chips. That's been our core line. That's what we launched with. That's how I started the mission of my company is to create delicious tortilla chips that don't break in guacamole. So this line very much is in service of that mission. But we also just launched this fall a new product line, which I'm really excited about, called Rolled. And what they are rolled tortilla chips, where basically you make a little tortilla chip, roll them up into, it kind of looks like a cigarette. I should think of some other shape to tell people, but it's kind of like a little tortilla cigarette that is heavily seasoned with spicy and provocative flavoring. And that launched nationally in Whole Foods. It's also in the Fresh Market, Thrive Market, places like that.
That chili lime, it goes crazy. That chili lime with some guac on the rolled SKU is definitely my favorite. So man, excited to have you with us today and excited to dive in. I think this is for sure our first a greener world certified brand. So we're excited to talk about that. Excited to talk some regen corn. You have a really cool background in CPG. So all the things are on the table today. But Zack, maybe take us back and maybe start with some of that CPG background even before we get to the brand, but kind of just your background in the space and how Zack's Mighty got started.
Sure. When I went to college, I had a degree in economics, and most people with an economics degree on the East Coast go into finance in New York. And I really didn't want to do that. It was important to me for some reason that I was able to physically touch whatever I was interacting with. And so my first job out of college was working at an organic granola company in San Francisco, where I was literally delivering granola, and down to offices in the financial district. And when I would deliver a 25-pound bulk box of granola at the loading dock and we'd sign a bill of lading, I was just in heaven, because it was all these economic concepts I had learned about actually happening in physical form. And I wasn't particularly wanting to go into food or natural food, I would have gone into any physical item. I would sell moccasins or, whatever it was. And it just happened to be, this was the job I got. And in the process of working at this small granola company where it was the founder, one other guy, and me, I fell in love with the food industry. I got my first taste of working with brokers, figuring out the kind of crazy review cycle, figuring out how grocery stores work, how a co-packer works. And I was there for about 2 years. And then my now wife, actually, we were friends at the time. She sent me a posting that these two guys from Brown had started a ketchup company, and they were looking to make their first hire in New York. And that was Sir Kensington's. And so I left and moved cross country to join Mark and Scott as their first employee. And from day one, they kind of just gave me, hey, you're in charge of all supply chain and all of retail sales, which is totally fine.
Just a little bit of scope out the gate.
Yeah. No big deal. But that's fine at a small company because it's so small, right? And it's easy to manage all your sales when you have 2 SKUs and no customers. So it definitely it grew and grew into something that ultimately was impossible to do everything. But for a period of about 5 years, 6 years, I was managing all retail sales, all operations. And it was incredible. It was such a cool experience to see the full life cycle of a product, from thinking of what to launch, sourcing the raw materials, finding a co-packer, getting it made, getting it sent to a warehouse, and then going in to meet with a buyer to pitch a promo plan. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but it was really setting me up well to start my own company because I knew how to create and launch products. And Sir Kensington's was an amazing experience. We ultimately sold to Unilever. I stayed on with Unilever for a year, and then decided I really needed to get back to the entrepreneurial space. So I left to start my own company without having any idea of what I was going to launch. And then it took me that was about a year of figuring out what I was going to do.
What did that year look like? Are you just like walking around grocery stores looking for stale categories, looking for opportunities to innovate, trying to find the white space? Like, what were some of the concepts that you had kind of kicked around before settling on Zack's Mighty?
Breaking a bunch of weak tortilla chips.
Yeah. Well, so tortilla chips was, it's interesting. Tortilla chips was sort of my original idea for many years. And like the joke at Sir Kensington's was about how I was always going to start a tortilla chip company because they're my favorite food. I would eat them all the time. Wow. But then when I left, sometimes you get so in your head with these things, and especially at that time in 2018, there were so many new trends happening where any idea that wasn't a trend just sounded dumb at first. And so at first I was like, well, tortilla chips sound dumb. Let me take a step back and figure out what's the right business to launch. And so I bought sales data, and I was reading all the trends, and I was trying to figure out what's hot. And at that time, it pointed me directly to adaptogens, turmeric, ashwagandha. I started working with a guy in Siberia to source chaga mushrooms. And I was like, well, maybe if I take some chaga mushrooms and sprinkle them on a lotus chip. And it was cool. And I know like a lot of people and a lot of cultures believe and swear by adaptogens, and they're great and they work for a lot of people. I just don't care about them and I don't use them. And so, as I'm like tinkering with these ashwagandha formulas, I was like, wait a minute, this is totally soulless. I don't care about this stuff. If I'm going to start a company, it can't just be because the Spins Trends report says it's a good idea. And so that was maybe honestly 5 months of the year. And I was actually working on it with a buddy. And then we decided to kind of, this isn't the idea. And we parted ways. So then I'm starting to feel like super insecure because I left Unilever. I'm going to start my own company, and this first idea was terrible. So then I was like, all right, I need to look outside of food. So I rented a house in upstate New York and brought a couple of my sisters there and some other people. And I did like a Shark Tank pitch to them where I had all these ideas of what I was going to do. One of them was like a furniture company where I was like, all right, with furniture, the problem is the last mile. But if I can convert the empty trash trucks that come into New York City to be able to carry furniture, that could be efficient. I had like a cell phone that didn't track your location that I was going to call Burner. It was way out stuff I would have no ability launching.
I love it.
And then the last idea was tortilla chips. And it just kept coming back to tortilla chips where ultimately I was like, okay, launching a business is hard, and no matter what it is, it's going to be hard. Every idea sounds stupid in the beginning, and I was getting a little too worried that just the idea was stupid. But then I realized, well, every idea is stupid because it's just an idea, and it's so easy for people to poke holes in your ideas early on. So I said, if I'm going to do it, it has to be something I love. Tortilla chips are my favorite food. I don't care if the data says this makes sense. I'm launching a tortilla chip company.
Wow.
Amazing. What about the data was telling you not to do tortilla chips? Was the category stale? Was it just not a lot of growth? Like, what were you seeing there that was trying to steer you away from where you eventually landed?
It's interesting because I actually looked at the data and fell in love with it compared to where I was coming from in condiments. And what I mean by that was what we experienced at Sir Kensington's was natural condiments are a very small category. And so we had times where we would launch a tartar sauce, for example, and quickly become the number one tartar sauce in the store. Yeah. But then that's just not a big business, and we had to SKU rationalize it. And so at Sir Kensington's, as we wanted to grow, that meant more and more and more and more SKUs because each individual category wasn't that big. And so at the time we sold to Unilever, we had like 60 SKUs. And what I immediately noticed when I looked at the tortilla chip data, I was like, well, wait a minute. The number 10 ranked tortilla chip outsells the number 1 ketchup. Like this is great. There's a lot more size here, and maybe it doesn't need to be about having so many SKUs. And there's plenty of examples of really successful single SKU brands in tortilla chips. So like Have a Chip is this great chip from the West Coast that's just been around for decades and has one SKU and crushes it. And so I was very attracted to the size of it, and it was growing. But it's funny because like anyone will have, if you like take category data to like any outside person just giving you advice, they're going to find a bad, like something negative about it. And so like when I tell people, oh, I'm going into the salty snack category, it's like, it's competitive. And it's like, well, no shit, it's competitive. It's competitive because it's such a big category. Everyone wants to be in it. And then if you tell someone, well, I'm going to start ketchup, they're like, small category. It's like, oh man. So I love the data when I saw it, but at a high level, the number one point of feedback I'd get early on was just saying, oh, that's a crowded category, which it was and is and always has and always will be. So kind of, how are you going to stand out?
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah. It's super interesting. And, I'm kind of cheating on the test here, Zach, because you and I have talked before, but I want you to tell the story about like why you chose the type of corn you did and the whole international sourcing journey there. Because I think it speaks really to the problem you're trying to solve on kind of the strength of the chip, right? So like there's a consumer angle and a sourcing/regen angle there. So take us through kind of how you stood up the initial products and supply chain. Cool.
Well, yeah, just going back to tortilla chips being my favorite food, one thing that really bothered me was when you get a weak tortilla chip that breaks because like to me, tortilla chip is a food and a tool. So if it breaks in guacamole, it's not serving its primary purpose. So I got really frustrated by that. So I'm not joking when I say the mission of our business is to create delicious and sturdy tortilla chips. Flavor and strength. That's the pillars of this business. And so when I was like, okay, I've got a background in supply chain. If I'm going to create a delicious tortilla chip, I need delicious corn. And so I just started noodling online, trying to look up and find and educate myself about corn. And I just fell down the rabbit hole of the 10,000 year history of corn. And what I learned was that there used to be this really delicious, flavorful type of corn that had migrated by trade from Mexico, what's now Mexico, but from Mexico up to the Northeast at about 1000 AD. And when it got to the Northeast, the winters were longer. It wasn't as warm. It morphed into something else. And what it morphed into was flint corn, FLINT. And flint corn is these long, narrow cobs with big, fat kernels, and they come in lots of different colors, and they're beautiful. And everything I read about it was how flavorful and delicious it was. And so I got really excited about that. But the problem with flint corn over time is that it has low yields. So in the mid 1800s, kind of through the mid 1900s, corn production in America started to move to a modern hybrid dent corn in the Midwest, where there's great growing conditions, certainly superior to the Northeast for corn. And the yield and the output kept getting higher and higher, more bushels per acre in these sort of more modern varieties. And the Northeast farmers couldn't keep up with their flint corn. So flint corn started to die out. But luckily, 300 years ago, by trade, flint corn came from New England over to Southern Europe. And since New England and Southern Europe are on the same latitude, it was comparable growing conditions, and it started to take off. So flint corn grew across Southern Europe, North Africa, and Asia. And as I was reading this, as a guy from Vermont, I was sort of blown away that New England corn had this big impact on world culinary history, because you just think of corn as a Midwest thing, being a modern American.
Right.
And so all this was super cool, but the reason I was interested in the corn was because it's supposed to taste really good, and I can't find it anywhere. I eventually found that there's like this underground corn resistance community of a couple New England Yankee farmers that are growing certain varieties
picturing like
of
the
flint
Star
corn.
Wars rebels of corn, as you like the way you're describing this, which is like the most oxymoronic, analogy there is, like space corn. But either way, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's great.
I'm picturing a doomsday bunker on like a picturesque Vermont farm just filled with corn.
Yeah, there probably is one of those. But what it's like, it's these families that for multiple generations have kept certain varieties of flint corn alive. And so I got my hands on a small amount of 5 varieties of flint corn. I said, I need to try this stuff to figure out, does it even make a difference if I fry it in oil to make a chip, or is frying in oil the great equalizer? So I hired a chef from Union Square Hospitality who had gone into Oaxaca and learned the whole process of nixtamal and making tortillas. And I had him make tortilla chips exactly the same way with my flint corn and standard control corn. And I was blown away by the flavor. And the main thing it tasted like was more like cornier, kind of like how an heirloom mushroom in the middle of the summer, an heirloom tomato in the middle of summer tastes more tomatoey. It was just kind of more corn. And it was really pleasant. And my favorite flavor was my favorite corn from this one family in Rhode Island. It's called Longfellow Yellow. And as far as I can tell, they're the only people left in the world growing Longfellow Yellow. And so I called these guys up and I said, I love the corn. I want to use it. How much? I want to buy it all. How much can you sell me? And they're like, well, we've got about 2,000 pounds of grain and about 20 pounds of seed. And that's not nearly enough to either use the seed to grow myself or to start a company. And so I felt a little dejected because I was like, God damn it, I spent 5 months working on, ashwagandha and chaga mushrooms. I just spent 6 months trying to start a flint corn chip company, and there's no flint corn. And so I then called a buddy of mine, Glenn Roberts from Anson Mills, who's the guy for landrace, heirloom, and ancient grains. And this is when he told me, he's like, flint corn might not be that big here, but it traveled to Italy. It was so delicious, it created polenta. The Italians have kept it alive. They call it otofile. And so I booked a plane ticket to Piedmont. I went seed hunting for 10 days in Italy. Eventually found a family that's a biodynamic certifier and a seed supplier. And they went and got me 2,000 pounds of certified seed grade corn. I became a corn importer with USDA, brought it back in, and partnered with 2 organic farms in New York.
Hell yeah. Amazing, so now you're growing your current flint supply back in the States using that seed from Europe.
Yeah, the original seed the first year came from Italy, but what's great about open pollinated heirloom things, unlike a hybrid modern corn, is we can save our seed from each crop to use as seed. So we only needed to buy from Italy once, and now we use our own seed every year grown in the U.S. to grow our U.S. acres.
Amazing.
Yeah. I'm gonna steal Kyle's thunder here because he usually kind of asks this question. But Zach, where were you at in the whole like organic or regenerative perspective at that point? Like, was that something you for sure wanted to do with the company? Were you thinking about sustainability at that point in terms of the growing practices? Like, how was that conversation as you brought the seed over here and you tried to set up the actual farming of it?
I definitely from the beginning wanted to have an organic tortilla chip. I've always really appreciated organic farming practices. I think for me, the conversations around organic are, there's great debate among them. Same with non-GMO and particularly how much better is it for you? And it's hard to know, right? Because you can find data and reports on both sides. But for me, I think when you trace it back up to the farm, organic farming practices always made more sense to me, certainly non-GMO farming practices than conventional farming. And that's where I think the best case is made for non-GMO and organic and now regenerative. So I knew I wanted to be close to the farm in my sourcing, meaning I didn't want to just buy ingredients from a broker. I wanted to have a relationship with the farm. And so organic from the beginning, I wanted to be organic. And so this is now 2019 when I'm building the supply chain. I had never heard of regenerative. I had no idea about regenerative. And so I was emailing with the buyer ahead of our meeting, and he was like, oh, it'd be cool if you were regenerative. And I was like, yeah, totally. And then I was like, wait, what is regenerative? And so I lucked out where the first year I partnered with 2 farms in New York, one in Hudson Valley and one up in the Buffalo area. And I lucked out in the sense that these are family organic farms, but they themselves happen to be big on the regenerative movement. So they educated me on what regenerative means, why it's important, why it's valuable. And kind of my first lesson was with Ben Dobson of Stonehouse Grain. And now the Hudson Carbon Institute. He was my first grower, and he and I went to Italy together to talk with the farmers to kind of learn how to grow this corn. And he's great, and he's a great person to learn from for the benefits of regenerative agricultural practices. And so the very first thing he taught me was cover cropping, and he shows me fields that had cover cropping and ones that did and ones that didn't. He taught me about the carbon cycle. Talked to me about the need for organic matter in the soil and how that's beneficial. And I was just hooked because it makes so much sense. And so from that point, I said, okay, if we're going to be growing our own corn, and when I say growing our own corn, I mean partnering closely with growers to grow our corn. We want to make a commitment that when we grow corn, it's going to be regenerative. And so this was 2019, and that's kind of how we decided to do that.
That's incredible. And what I love about this story is, I hope this doesn't come off as a negative, but it's almost like accidentally regenerative. And regenerative has, 3 really primary attributes, right? It tastes better, it's better for your human health, and it's better for the planet. And in your absolute insane pursuit of taste and deliciousness, it led you towards regenerative. And I think that's really compelling because we talk a lot about, how do we get people to understand what regenerative is and why are they going to care? And if it doesn't taste good, it doesn't really matter. So the fact that pursuit led you towards an heirloom variety that is grown in a regenerative fashion is just really, really cool. And I really appreciate that side of the story. I don't know where I was going to go from there. Just wanted to comment on that, to be honest. Totally lost my train of thought.
It's a good point because I feel strongly kind of in the positioning of our products and our brand. Like I very much want to support the regenerative movement and regenerative agriculture, but I don't want to ever trick myself into thinking as like, that's the reason why someone will or should buy my product. And my product needs to taste good. It needs to perform in guacamole. It needs to be priced appropriately. It needs to deliver on all these core things and be regenerative. But it's a trick sometimes to think, if you think too much, well, regenerative is the thing, you might let these other things slip. And it's just hard to then put the burden all on the consumer to say, well, sacrifice these 3 things to get this. And it's like, no. The standard is we all have to incorporate regenerative into excellent products. And so, on our packaging, it's like, I don't know. We don't make a huge fuss about being regenerative. I mean, maybe some folks would say we do, but it's certainly not like the primary reason to buy it on our packaging and in our messaging, because I don't think that is the primary reason to buy for most consumers. There's certainly some, but for most.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're spot on. I was actually planning to talk about the branding. Sorry, AC. But yeah, it's a really approachable brand, and it's not like it's these colors that are designed to look like the earth, or it's about saving the planet. It's about like a fun, really tasty chip brand. I'm also, as you're describing, like you keep referencing this like guacamole, like it has to perform in guacamole. And I'm thinking about like your sales comparison chart that you like bring in a slide deck to a retailer, and you have all the different things stacked up. And there's like a guacamole performance column on the left, and you're like, can hold like X amount of weight, like my chip is here and everybody else is here. I need to see that chart. I think it'd be so good. And as somebody who grew up eating Tostitos restaurant style, very thin, very large, breaks every day. My dad literally used to open the bag the night before we would eat them, so they'd be 1 day stale, so they'd be a little bit stronger but not bad. It was that level of strategic chip eating in my house. So
that's amazing.
Appreciate your commitment to making sure that the guac or the chip performs with guac, and I can certainly say that it does.
That's great. That's great.
I think we need to trademark the chip strength index and have that on pack somewhere or something. Yeah. But I have a personal story that just totally validates that whole conversation of like my brother, works in food and he's like into sustainability, but nowhere near like where I'm at. And I think the first regenerative product that him and his family bought was Zack's Mighty, just because like they were at the fresh market, they looked good, they tasted good. And he like sent me a picture. He's like, "Hey dude, we bought like a regenerative product and we eat them regularly." I'm like, "Hell yeah." So it just goes to show like that. Yeah, and that's the ticket for the mass market. Like we're not going to scale, especially into the mass market, like leading with regenerative. Regenerative has to follow all the amazing attributes and be tied to it as the reason for it, or as kind of like an enhancer of it. So yeah, totally agree there. We talk about that a lot, but I think it's really hard with all the purchase intent data and the rhetoric around sustainability and regenerative to like get people to focus on that and stay disciplined to that, because there's a lot of bright, shiny objects, I think, that lie to you and tell you that you can lead with it. So I have empathy for founders and brands in terms of just kind of getting lost there. And now the forgetting is becoming contagious, because I had a segue there and I forgot what it was.
It's okay. I'm queued up. Zach, you go ahead.
Regenerative's definitely right now, I think can, in certain retailers, like can help you win out getting through the first door of sales, which is you got to get on the shelf and you got to get through the buyer. And so in a competitive category, if a buyer's looking at a bunch of items, there's certain retailers where if it's kind of even and one's regenerative, that very much will win out and that'll get you on the shelf. But then you got to sell, because if you don't sell, these regenerative commitments might not be as strong at the next review that the retailer has, because it's got everything's a business. So regenerative, I think at this stage right now is, and in a good way, because a lot of retailers are making this commitment and they're saying, wait a minute, we'll be leaders. We'll start to add regenerative to our shelf. And so it's almost like if we can get more regenerative products and have them interact with consumers like your brother, where they're buying them for a different reason, but then they happen to be regenerative, that's the movement growing, in addition to having products for the early adopters who are seeking regenerative.
Amen.
I think that's a great pivot. Let's talk a little bit about the brand story and the journey at retail specifically. So I think you mentioned like 2019, 2020-ish. Sounds like it's when the brand launched. What was your first account you landed? What did your performance look like relative to the category? What did expansion look like? Why did you choose to expand the way you did? Walk us through that journey.
Sure. So my first meeting was I pitched Whole Foods in April of 2019 for the reset that was going to happen in January of 2020. And I wanted to pitch to Whole Foods because I really enjoy working with them. I had a great experience with them at Sir Kensington's. I felt like I knew how UNFI worked, how their promos worked. I felt comfortable with them as an account. And when I was at Sir Kensington's, it was still at that time when I first joined in 2011, 2012, the playbook was very much grab one or two regions of Whole Foods and then work your way regionally, and you're presenting to every regional buyer. And it started to morph to you can still be regional, but it started to morph to a situation where you could also be global from the beginning. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to launch with scale, and I wanted to be national. And so I pitched them in April. And so now I had my seed hunting trip in Italy in February. I can't plant the corn in America until May, June. I can't harvest it until September, and I can't really make the chips. So I'm kind of a little cart before the horse, but I presented to Whole Foods in April. And
how did you get samples? If your manufacturing supply chain wasn't totally set up, are you just doing like custom one-offs for samples for the meeting, or what did that look like?
I bought enough grain that I could do a small factory trial and get enough sealed bags. So I had the product. It's just luckily the alignment of the Whole Foods cycle matched harvest. So I could then go plant it and decide whether or not to put a down payment with all these growers in May based off of my April meeting. So I presented to Whole Foods, and I really wanted to work with them, and I thought we had a cool product. I thought it was unique. And so I gave them a 1-year exclusive offer to go national, and they accepted it. So we launched nationally in January of 2020. And it was really exciting, to see your product on the shelf. And we also had a really great Super Bowl in February of 2020. And Super Bowl is the #1 chip holiday of the year. So the demos were working great, and it was really encouraging. And then COVID hit, and it was like awful. Like we did so bad in 2020. And a big part of that is because they even took away promos for a bit. Demos were gone the whole year, which was going to be super important for my business because I never aligned with a specific diet. I just had a great tasting chip. So I wanted people to try it. And buying behaviors in COVID was very much people going in and out, buying what they want and not discovering. So famously in Whole Foods, and John Mackey even said this, like items that launched new in 2020 didn't do well. And we did not do well. And it was really discouraging. And luckily, we had a lot of support from Whole Foods, the buyer, and their head of grocery. They were committed to regenerative. They thought what we were doing was cool. And they also understood that the pandemic was nuts and had a big impact on new brands launching. So they were, they gave us time to kind of get back on track in 2021. In 2021, we also had the wrong bag size at the beginning. We resized our bag. And in 2021, demos came back. So basically from 2021 till now, we've been constantly growing in the account, which has been great. But 2020 was awful and terrifying.
Tell us a little bit about, like, specifically, we haven't touched on this yet, but from a manufacturing perspective, your company actually makes a real tortilla that you cut into chips that you then, I don't know if it's bake or fry, but walk us through like why that is unique to the category and how that changes the profile of the chip. Because to your point on demos, like for anybody who hasn't tried a Zack's Mighty tortilla chip, it is so, you could blindfold me and give me 9 different chips and I could tell you which one is Zack's Mighty easily. Yeah. It's that different of an experience. So tell us about that, why that's important to you, how that affects the chip strength and the flavor and so on and so forth.
Cool. So going back to the pillars of this business being strength and flavor, everything we've talked about with corn is related to flavor. On the strength side, that's all in the process and how you make the chip. And probably the biggest discovery I had when I started working on tortilla chips was learning that most tortilla chips on the market are not made from tortillas. And I just thought kind of as a consumer that that's how you make a tortilla chip from a tortilla, but that's not the common practice for what you buy in a grocery store. So the authentic way of making a tortilla chip is making tortillas, stacking those tortillas, letting them rest for a period of time, and then chopping them, frying them, and seasoning them. That's what most restaurants do. So that's why you might have wondered, how come I can always get such great chips at a random hole-in-the-wall restaurant that's much better than what I can buy in the store? A big part of that is the process, where most packaged food tortilla chip companies have moved toward.
This is the chip tortilla, like people, the siren, they were coming for you because they didn't want you to reveal their secrets. They're on their way. Had to know.
Yeah, big tortilla is definitely after me. But so the way that most companies make their tortilla chips is they sheet out a big piece of masa, the dough. Like think about a big sheet of pasta, basically. And then right there from the wet dough, they stamp out the shape of the chip they want. So it could be a triangle, a strip, or a circle. Then that goes to the oven and bakes, and then it fries immediately. And so that's called a continuous process. And the benefit of it is it requires fewer bodies on the line, so labor costs are less. It takes less time to produce, so output is higher and when you spread the overhead cost over a shift. And it's just a much more efficient and cost-effective way of making a chip. The problem with that process is it loses the magic of what happens when you bake a tortilla, let it equilibrate and rest under pressure of other tortillas, and then chop it. There's some aesthetic things such as when you slice a baked tortilla, you get those sharp corners. So you can kind of tell just by looking at a chip if it was made from a tortilla or not. But the more important thing is I initially thought that what makes a strong chip versus a weak chip was just the thickness, but it is entirely determined by did it come from a tortilla or not. Because when it stacks and rests, that moisture equilibrates before going into the fryer, and that creates a much harder bite, a much sturdier chip. So I kind of learned this when I went to my first co-packer. I brought them all of my favorite tortilla chips on the market. And I said, I like these. And then I had 4 that I liked and 8 I didn't like because I wanted to get aligned on flavors. And they quickly looked at it and they said, well, you like all these you like were made from tortillas and all these ones you don't like were made inline. And so that's when I said, okay, shit, I have to make these from tortillas. But the problem is if 98% of what's on the market is made in this inline process, most co-packers are made for that process. So it has been this major journey for us, and we've had to invest in our own production and partner with co-packers to build dedicated lines so that we can scale this tortilla first process. And so it's on the mass scale, doing that is rare, but it's not completely rare. There's other companies that do this as well that I want to shout out because I think they're awesome chips. Mi Niña out of Boston is a fantastic chip. They do it the right way, tortilla first. Vista Hermosa out of New York does it that way. Yeah. There's Donkey chips in the Midwest. There's Casa Sanchez in California. There's Have a Chip. So every kind of region has its amazing tortilla first chip, but we're trying to build a nationally distributed tortilla first supply chain made with weirdo lost Flint corn while also being regenerative. And it's a lot of things that kind of keep us up at night.
Yeah. It's amazing the parallels after doing so many of these episodes, and you're making it sound very simple, Zach, but like all these regenerative brands that are basically doing direct sourcing are really involved with the actual production of the raw ingredients. There's usually massive processing differences and an investment there, whether it's actually hardcore CapEx or just, intellectual and sweat equity. But it really matters in terms of like how the product ends up becoming what it becomes. I want to pivot back to the regen piece just to marry the commercial story with the regenerative claims of
sure.
Now on the main big chip bags, there's a little kind of button copy on the front that talks about regeneratively farmed corn. I believe there's something on the back, and you have the AGW seal on the back, if I'm remembering correctly. Yep. When did AGW come into the picture? For how long have you been making any sort of regenerative claim like on pack in terms of romance copy? And you made a comment to me in a previous conversation that I just want to double click on or have, give you the opportunity to talk more about, which was you really didn't want to make claims, I believe, until you had some sort of third-party validation. So just walk us through that whole order of operations of the supply chain work married to the commercial kind of claims piece.
Absolutely. I felt very strongly from the beginning, I don't want to make any regenerative claim until we have a third-party certifying body certify us as such. And I felt that way because as I was learning about regenerative and the landscape, what you kind of experience is there's a little bit of murkiness here. And some of the murkiness is just folks making the claim without going through the process of certifying or having auditors come and inspect. Then there's a bit of murkiness where there's multiple agencies you can choose from that have a lot of mostly alignment, but little differences. And then you have kind of it's always interesting when new certs get codified and then you try to go back and tell the grower who's been doing it for generations, like why something should be a certain way. And so for all of this, I said, okay, for our position is let's hold off on making any regenerative claims until we get a certification, because I think that's fairest to the consumer is us saying we're certified by a greener world than as opposed to just we're saying we're regenerative. And so our journey to choose a greener world was, so in 2019, when we first started growing, when you look up regenerative at that time, the first thing that comes up is the ROA. And at that time, the pilot was closed and the cert wasn't open. And so we were like, okay, well, we want to go down the process of getting certified, but we're kind of in the in-between of, once they finished their pilot, they had a period of kind of reviewing the data and talking it through. And so it wasn't ready for brands to apply. So what we did was we hired 2 separate consultants to build our own regenerative standards internally. And the reason we did that is because early on, in the first few years, we started every year adding additional farmers to our network, because we were very nervous about this heirloom corn we were growing and wanted to keep growing it at different parts of the U.S., test out different climates, but also have backup plans if one farm failed. Because we had that happen in our first year. One farm lost its entire crop, and that put us in a bind. Wow. And so we said, okay, if we're going to be internally if we want to have a regenerative standard, let's hire a consultant, let's make a regenerative standard, and we'll use that for now in 2020 as we're getting new farms until we're certified third party. And then a greener world, I can't remember who sent it to me originally. Someone sent it to me, but a greener world was a few years behind ROC, and they were starting their pilot program. So when I talked to my growers about, hey, we can wait for ROA or we can join this pilot program, they were very eager to join the pilot program because they wanted a voice in this new movement. Because as I alluded to earlier, like a lot of regenerative practices that are now being kind of set are just common sense things that organic growers have been doing for many years. Yeah. And they were a little skeptical of some of the stuff that was being said, or exactly what does reduced tillage mean and what's the benefit of that. And that might mean something different in Northern California than it does in the Northeast. Right. And so they wanted to participate in the conversation, as did we. And there was really nowhere you could apply at that time. So we did it. So we were part of the pilot program for a greener world. I think, one nuance from them is that they don't require you to be organic, which I think makes sense from a standpoint of trying to get more acreage, starting to do things like cover cropping, even if it's not organic, that can have a huge impact. So I thought the scalability of that was interesting. We were in the pilot program of Greener World, and that's who certified our corn as being regenerative.
Super appreciate that share. And it's interesting to hear, like, you are organic, but you chose to go with a certification agency that doesn't require organic because you believe that in order to scale regenerative acreage, like, we need to have that accessibility point, right? So I thought that was really interesting share. I'm curious, and this is really interesting. AC and I are like totally role reversal on today's podcast. I'm gonna keep flipping it back away from regen. But you mentioned like the different, you have a relatively, call it, I don't want to use the term vulnerable, but you're concerned about this heirloom variety of flint corn. You're working with very specific farmers. You're growing like crazy. You have a very unique manufacturing process. How do you juggle the supply side with like your first Costco rotation? How are you maintaining the growth you're seeing, while at the same time checking to make sure that your regenerative supply stays healthy and not, at risk of, running out of stock?
Great question.
Yeah. So my intention in 2019 was to have a 100% flint corn chip. And that year we grew with 2 farms in New York, and one of the farms had a complete failure. And what I mean by that is what we learned is that flint corn, the husk wraps much more tightly around the cob. And so normal practice with growing corn is you leave corn in the field to let it dry down before you harvest it. But our tightly sealed husks weren't drying down. And therefore, when the frost came, they developed mold. And so we lost an entire, one of our farms, we lost everything. And so we couldn't do a 100% flint corn chip because there's nowhere else I can buy flint corn. Right. And I was thinking, I was like, well, wait a minute. Do I need to set up a second farm in Uruguay so I'm on alternating hemispheres and I can have 2 harvests a year? And that got complicated. And so what we did was we said, okay, how can we blend organic regenerative flint corn with organic regenerative dent corn into a place where the flavor of the flint still comes through, but we've got a blend window we're comfortable with that can help us ebb and flow versus either demand or yields in the future. And so our chip is a blend of flint corn and dent corn. Both of them are organic, both of them are regenerative, but it's a blend of those two. And so the answer to the question of, well, how do we manage all this now is it's really simple. We're just very long on corn. So we've got a lot of corn.
Yeah.
What does the regenerative dent corn market look like in the U.S. right now? I wasn't aware that there were a lot of people growing regenerative dent. I thought it was all heirloom variety. That shows you my level of ignorance in the corn world. But what was it like finding those suppliers? And as you continue to grow, and you mentioned you're being long on corn, is that like ample supply, or are you actively trying to find new farmers who want to transition towards regenerative practices?
It's our same farmer. So we have the same.
Okay.
So I alluded to at one point, we started sprinkling our demand out among lots of different growers. And we did that for 2-3 years. And then once we kind of learned more about the best way to grow the flint or the dent, what the best nutrient package is, what the best climate is for it, we centralized it. We realized, okay, having all these small decentralized amounts of corn is killing us in freight. Let's centralize to our grower that we're kind of closest with, that has the most robust practices, and that has plenty of capacity, plenty of acreage, and where the yields are good. And so that is a grower in Iowa. His name's Bryce Earlbeck. He's sort of a famous organic grower in Iowa. And so he grows our flint corn and our dent corn on his regenerative certified farm. So we've centralized everything with one guy. I don't believe there was any certified regenerative dent corn before we did it. I'm pretty sure Arrowhead Mills has a certified popcorn, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't think there was. So I think we were certainly the first flint corn because we're the only ones growing flint corn. But I think we were the first to have a certified regenerative flint and dent. So it's not readily available. It's just easier to grow.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's so interesting to learn about like the plumbing of how all this gets done, right? Because you see that end product on the shelf and it's in the shiny bag and it looks cool. And like, there's just so much stuff that goes into getting there. And that's kind of a good segue, Zach, into something I'd love to have you talk to is why the new rolled SKUs? Like, where did that come from? What opportunity did you see there? The 3 main hero tortilla chip SKUs make a ton of sense, right? Sea salt, nacho, and lime. I love the lime. That's personally my favorite. But why did you add these 2 new additional kind of SKUs in this new product line with the rolled piece?
Yeah. So we started first as a single SKU tortilla chip company. So we just had sea salt. And when you're a tortilla chip company and you start thinking about other things you can do, there's kind of different paths you can go down. So a lot of, if you go look at in a Whole Foods or any account, you'll see a lot of tortilla chip brands then have their salsa. So you can kind of be a chip and salsa brand. Mm-hmm. And we thought, well, maybe that makes sense for us because, we are built for dipping and that would be a good idea. But I felt like the best salsas are the refrigerated ones. And that's a very complicated supply chain and probably not something we were well positioned to do.
And you like guac better than salsa anyway, so
yeah, totally. It has
exactly. To be I also like dipping them in hummus too. That's probably my daily snack. But so we said, okay, I think we're more excited about being a snack company than maybe because the other question people would ask us is, well, if you're making these great tortillas to make your chips, why don't you launch tortillas? And so you could have tortillas and salsa. And so we decided we want to be a snack company. So we came out first with the additional flavors, which glad you like them. And then so when it came to rolled, so an important point here is our rolled chips are not regenerative and they're not organic. And so the question is, well, why? Why are we okay doing that? I was okay with them not being organic. They're non-GMO, and they're the first non-GMO certified rolled chip on the market. And so we were okay with them not being organic because we were brainstorming this SKU with the Whole Foods buyer, and we were very cognizant of price point. And the tricky thing about a rolled chip is that the point of the rolled chip is that it's very intense. And you get that intensity through lots of seasoning. And seasoning is so expensive. And organic seasoning is even more expensive. And so to have an organic seasoned rolled chip is absolutely possible. But our bag that's $4.99 would be more like $8.99 with the amount of organic seasoning and the organic oil. And so we thought that probably that doesn't make sense. Like that doesn't make sense for someone to pay that much.
Just so people understand, we're talking about more like a single serve bag here on the rolled. It's not a big tortilla chip bag. So that'd be a crazy price for this. Like this is more of like a typical Lay's potato chip size bag. Just want to add that.
Yeah. It's 7 ounces. The rolls are more compact, so the bag's always going to be smaller. But yes, visually it would be insane for this bag to be that expensive. So then when it came to regenerative, we very much wanted to use our regenerative corn. And I still hope to be able to switch this eventually. And I don't want to nerd out too much on the differences, but basically we grow corn at our farms and we send the corn that is shelled and dried and cleaned. Whole corn kernels go into our tortilla manufacturing facility and we cook whole corn kernels the night before every cook. And so that's very easy to use. To make the rolled chips, we have to start with a masa flour because it's a lot more uniform and that's required for us to be able to roll it, which is a delicate process. The way to turn corn into masa flour is more complicated and there's like 3 massive companies that do it. And we just don't have a good way right now of taking our corn and turning it into masa flour. So we had to say, okay,
interesting, man. Super interesting detail.
And so, and furthermore, being able to make rolled chips is very difficult. There's basically Takis, which owns their own production facility. There's Frito-Lay, which has Dinamitas. And then there's one co-packer in the US that can make rolled tortilla chips that we're working with. Wow. And so it's not a common practice at all. And so we couldn't make it, we decided not to make it organic for price point. I couldn't make it regenerative to start, which I was okay with. And so the question you asked me was, why launch the rolled? The answer is because they're delicious and exciting and I wanted to do it. And that's kind of, that's all it is like, I think rolled chips are so much fun. I wanted to have it. We had an opportunity to do it. Whole Foods was excited about it because Takis, they're the number 3 ranked tortilla chip brand in the US behind Doritos and Tostitos. And so Takis have been around forever, but a place like Whole Foods has never been able to sell them because they have banned ingredients. Same with Fresh Market, same with Thrive Market. And so for us to have the first clean label, non-GMO certified rolled chip, that was exciting to a lot of folks on the buyer side. It was exciting to us internally. And it's just a fun product and we had fun doing it. It is interesting though, being a regenerative brand first and then doing a non-regenerative item, because it seems like that triggers a lot of questions, which is interesting because there's a lot of non-regenerative brands that launch a single regenerative item and then that's like a high five. And it's funny because I don't think we betrayed our values by launching a non-regenerative item, but I guess I guess the consumer will let us know.
Yeah.
I think it's a really great point, and it reminds me of when, what was the original brand name? Cosmic Bliss, or they rebranded. It was a vegan ice cream company that decided they wanted to add a grass-fed dairy line, and people went ballistic. They were like, "We're boycotting forever. We hate you," and really, like, they're just trying to understand and realize, like, hey, grass-fed dairy can be really good, and it's a different consumer segment, and it allows us to grow our company and enter a new category. And it feels like that's what you're doing. And at the same time, not only are you just doing it from a market perspective, you're taking that roll chip category in a healthier direction. So I think it's really great work, and I think it's a valuable observation you made that, like, to be regenerative first, you can't launch something that's non-regenerative. And I think that's interesting. We've never had a brand on the pod before who's done that.
Yeah.
Well, first for everything. Glad I could provide that for you guys.
It also goes back to a lot of the commentary earlier in the episode about just like, how do we leverage commercial tailwinds as Trojan horses for regenerative? And when you understand that full context that Zach just gave, it's like, okay, that makes perfect sense. And if anyone's ever going to do a regenerative rolled chip, it would be y'all. So why don't you get started with this thing that is already an improvement that can take advantage of these awesome market trends where, like, there is no Taki equivalent in natural, like, available. And then eventually we can make it regenerative. Like, it makes me think a lot about the last episode with Kyle from Wildway, where he talks about, like, look, we were a bootstrap brand for 11 years and had to really get to scale, nail our own manufacturing, and get all these fundamentals in order to then be able to make the regenerative impact we want to make on the raw ingredient side. So there's not one right path. And I think that's actually the biggest impediment to the regenerative movement, is all the conversations where we make things about either ors and we make things about this perfect utopian path instead of just working our asses off to make improvement and kind of embrace that progress over perfection.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
Totally agree. Zach, you mentioned the Taki is the roll chip. You've got the 3 SKUs of original, I don't know what you want to call that line, Flint corn, but whatever the line might be called. What else is in the future for Zack's Mighty? You mentioned a snack company. Does that potentially mean venturing outside of corn at some point in time? Like, what's the grand vision? You know, Zack's Mighty is a great name because it doesn't pigeonhole you. It's not Zack's tortilla chips. You know, so where do you want to go with this thing?
I don't want to come across as a visionless founder, but my vision is that I need to get through this upcoming Costco rotation and execute that properly, and get through 2020, get through 2024. I always find it so funny when we do these 3-year forecasts. It's like the rate at which stuff changes. Yeah. The 3-year forecast is just one example on paper of what's not going to happen. And so I think in terms of, here's what I can say about our vision. And we already have the next product line, which we're super excited about, that we will be presenting in the next few months for distribution in probably Q3 of 24. This still has corn in it. It's still a snack. But I think where we have decided is where we want our position to be is to innovate. And obviously everyone says that, but what I mean specifically is, you know, the tortilla chips are probably our most renovation item, where tortilla chips existed and we came in with a tortilla chip we thought was better. But at the same time, we're the only chip with flint corn. We're tortilla first, which is unique, and we're the first and only chip made with certified regenerative corn. So there is some newness to that. The Takis are the rolled chip is a good example because they are this literally doesn't exist in the accounts we're going in. Right. And so that shape and form factor not existing is really attractive to me as we think ahead. And so I guess the point I'm getting at is, would we jump over and launch a regenerative potato chip? That excites me less than trying to hold our feet to the fire a little bit more and try to bring the buyers things that literally don't exist in their set. And that's what we've got for next year. And so what happens beyond that? I don't know. Could we do something crazy and jump into another random category? I think ultimately, like if I'm trying to balance business factors with core values and strategy, I think it's always going to come down to, do I think this is awesome, and am I excited about it? Is it fun? Will probably trump a lot of other things. So I could see us doing something stupid in the future of launching, some frozen pizza because we thought we made some cool cornmeal flint corn crusted pizza, and it makes total sense to me, and maybe would be an epic failure. But I don't know. I don't really have a great answer because it's evolving.
I love the answer. And I think that part of your innovation checklist is like, does it work with guac? And if the answer is no, like, it's off the table.
Before he started talking about new innovations that aren't on shelf yet, I was like, what are all the salty snacks that are too weak that we need to make stronger? That's a big one. I want to just say a couple comments too about the whole like visionless versus like focus and discipline. And I actually think it's really important to highlight this. And as someone that is an investor in the space, like we ask every founder to put together this grand vision and to put together a financial model. And all you know about it really is that it's going to be wrong. You do still need to make the team do that so you can see that they're going to be able to do that exercise and do it continually as the brand grows. But I was talking to a very seasoned CPG investor that's had a ton of success the other day, who I won't name, but he basically just said focus and discipline are the number 1 and 2 things he looks for in founders, because there's always a chance to basically grow that hero product line or kind of grow the hero business you already have, whether that's like growing your ACV in natural or, when you get above that kind of $100 million mark, doing that in MULO. And he's like, the number 1 mistake everyone has ever made in our portfolio is just being unfocused and like the bright, shiny object syndrome. And I thought it was really interesting because he talked about basically that same disease exists at the really early stage when everything's fun and new and there's all this white space. And when you have a misperception, once you've really scaled that, like there's nothing else to do with this core line. And he was basically like, a lot of times that's just not true. So just interesting insights there that I thought were compelling.
Yeah, I find that sentiment very true with my experience at Zack's Mighty and Sir Kensington's, where it's kind of counterintuitive, where sometimes opportunity can be the thing that's most lethal to your survival. And you got to put blinders on sometimes and stay focused.
Yeah.
Do more with core, as they say.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that. Sit-ups. Yeah. Chris Tolles at Yardstick was on a podcast the other day. They're a soil carbon measurement ag tech tool. And he said, this quote just like slapped me in the face. Startups don't starve, they drown. And I was like, damn, that is true, man. It's really true.
That's great. Well, luckily we're in a drought in the a lot of areas. So,
Zack, this has been unreal conversation, man. Super, super insightful. Just appreciate the work you're doing and sharing so transparently with our audience. I'm going to take us home with our final question that we asked everybody, which is, how do we get Regen brands to have 50% market share by 2050?
I think there's push and pull, where consumer awareness is always going to be helpful, of course, and people vote with their dollars. But I think policy is really exciting. I think government investment and subsidies and cover cropping just as a start, because a cover crop even has huge impact, positive impacts on conventional farming as well. Yeah. And I think if there's ways that we can sort of sneak regenerative in to the ingredient supply chain, almost so if there's a way to remove the challenge from convincing everyone who's at the grocery store and everyone that's making decisions on sourcing at big food companies to buy into regenerative, but if instead you could start to fill the streams that they participate in with regenerative items, I think that can, 50% is a big number. So I think something like that would need to happen. So I'd love to see more policy, more support, more dollars invested in that for growers. And I think it's a lot of commitment from the other gatekeepers, like the buyers. And I think a lot of buyers are doing a really good job right now. Like I said, like there are absolutely buyers right now that in a tie between new items will favor regenerative, and that helps.
Question. I want to pause you there, Zach, because the question I have for that is that's absolutely true, but is it enough? Like, should they be doing more is my question to ask the retailers. And I've asked a couple of them specifically, some very prominent and important ones, and they kind of said no, like they really feel like that access to shelf is enough. But it seems like from a lot of our conversations, it might not be from the brand side, but that's obviously maybe biased. But like, what do you think about that? Sorry to cut you off, but wanted to ask.
Absolutely, that's enough. Like, what more can you ask for from a retailer than brand space? I mean, it's so hard to get a meeting. It's so hard to get a yes. If they put you on the shelf, like that's their job's done. It's now your job to make sure it's a success. And so it's like, I mean, what more do you want from a retailer than putting you on the shelf? It's absolutely enough. And that's a huge commitment from the retailers. And I think the fact that they'll be patient, or they'll give maybe a longer leash to regenerative brands to get their act together. But I see this with many startups, so they don't truly realize that once you get on the shelf, it is your responsibility to sell it, not the retailers. And so, I think absolutely that's enough on retailers getting you on the shelf. And then it switches over to groups like yours who are trying to build consumer awareness. It switches to the brands trying to get it to sell. But it kind of goes back to, like, I like having a regenerative corn tortilla chip, but that's not what was the time period you said? What time period are we?
2050.
Oh, okay. So we got some time. But like over the next few years, at least next 5 years, being regenerative is not going to be why people buy my product. And so I think realizing that that regenerative is a standard that you have as part of what you sell, but not necessarily the reason, that'll help, I think, grow the movement as well. But I don't know.
Think it's really great insight. No, I think that's great insight, and especially for your category, like nobody's buying tortilla chips because they're wanting to be healthier, make healthier choices, right? So the fact that you can be a healthier choice within that category, I think is a really great option, but it's not like, oh man, like New Year, new me, January, like I need to up my tortilla chip intake, right? Like nobody's doing that. So to your point, like that's not going to be the pull to get them to buy your brand. So I think that's a really great call out. I had another question, but man, today really is the day of like make a comment, lose your question. I don't know what the deal is.
You're leaving us speechless, Zach. It's so good, you know?
I will say that was the most epic new item innovation tease we've ever had on the podcast. I am so curious as to what this thing is that you're going to make, and we won't force you to share it on the pod if you don't want to. But I do want to say thank you for your time. Super interesting story. Love the work you're doing. For anybody listening, the website is Zack's, ZACKS mighty.com. Check it out. There's some beautiful videos there. I actually like the tortillas being cut on the line. I love that transparency. I think that's really cool. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for being here. Thanks for making these chips. They're fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks for trying them. Thanks for having me. And thanks for your spotlight on Regen.
Absolutely. Thanks, brother. Appreciate you, man.
All right. Bye.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.